Hello and welcome back to this new episode of the China and Africa podcast. And today it's not going to be Eric's voice, but it's going to be my voice, Géraud, the Africa editor, with Cobus Van Staden, our managing editor, who's joining us from Johannesburg today. Good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
So it's really a pleasure to be the two of us today. So we're going to have it's like a mini roundtable without Eric. It's going to be a conversation. As we know, it's a China Africa podcast, so it's going to be a conversation on different topics that we found quite interesting that happened this week around China-Africa conversation. Cobus has brought us some very interesting topic related to trade, tariffs, and all of that. And we're going to try to go into details on that to see what's really happening and how things are unfolding in the China-Africa space this week. And many things have been happening on the global scales, many things in terms of geopolitics that may impact Africa in a certain way or another. And all of that, we need to be aware of that. We really need to be following those situations because sometimes when you have those too much information, you tend to not to see where the relevance in that debate are for African countries. And yes, I'm going to stop there. I don't want to go too much into the details. So, Cobus, tell us, what do you have for us for this conversation today?
A really interesting development in Angola. It was announced this week that Sinohydro, the huge Chinese company, is investing $100 million in grain development, like kind of development of grain farming in Angola. And that comes after an announcement last week that another Chinese company, Citic, is investing $250 million also in soybean and maize kind of farming in Angola as well. So it's a very interesting development. Like, you know, we through the years, if people who follow China-Africa stuff know that there's been this kind of ongoing kind of drumbeat about this idea that of Chinese land grabs, quote unquote, in Africa, and then also the idea that parts of Africa will grow crops to export to China. So, you know, that has been debunked famously by Deborah Brautigam, who dedicated an entire book to kind of unpacking this issue and debunking it. There seems to be an interesting new development in this field. What Sinohydro was saying is that 60% of this grain is actually going to be exported to China, and the rest is going to be used locally, and then it's going to be a mix of commercial and local community farms. So they're going to be dividing a huge amount of land. Like they're leasing it. They got a 25-year lease on a large amount of land, which they're then going to be dividing into plots, some commercial and some community farming. So it's a very interesting kind of development, particularly in the context of China shifting its agricultural imports away from the US.
Oh, yes, definitely. It's a very interesting topic, as you mentioned, because two things are coming into mind. First of all, we remember that when João Lourenço came into power, when he visited China, I think I visited China two or three times. And in this last time when he was there, he made a call to Chinese investors saying that we want China to diverse its investment in Angola. Because for those who've been following China and Africa, we know that for so many years, China in Angola was equals to oil, petroleum investment, and we know that it's also with large infrastructure. And Angola was trying to say, well, you know what, we want China to be our partner in other sectors than the oil sector. And seeing those kind of development, it's really something it's quite interesting to follow because it's also signaling the willingness of China to adapt into new environment. And its second point, this is where I wanted to get to. It also plays out into the FOCAC, the FOCAC drum beats and all the declaration that we had last September, the declaration about agriculture and what China is intending to do. In many African countries, investment is it's intending to pull in those African countries. And still in agriculture, when we leave Angola, we see a larger trend that's taking place on the continent where you see a lot of Chinese agricultural farms are taking place in Africa, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Ghana, in different parts of the continent, in the DRC, in Burundi, where you have Chinese farmers also, even in Zambia, if I remember correctly. Those kind of news that we don't really pay attention to them because, it's farm. And when you talk farming, we also see that, all agricultural products under, those aid approach. So it doesn't really catch attention to headlines made it because it's not really, let's face it, politically sexy or news sexy enough to talk about it. So we don't pay attention to that and we don't see those kind of news. But I think there is a lot of things that are happening in agriculture sector that we have to pay attention to, that if we do not, we may really miss really what China is really trying to build in the agricultural land, in agriculture business in Africa. And that's going to be very important. And third point, Angola. This is what I wanted to get as well. Angola, geopolitics of it. And when I saw the news, when you shared it, I was like, oh, that's interesting. Because when we talk about Angola geopolitics, remember there is another project, the Lobito Corridor project, which basically was first and foremost a infrastructure project. But we remember that there is a agriculture component to it that, the form that the Biden administration wanted to add into it. We still don't know if under the Trump we're gonna see those projects materializing, but we do know that there is also an agriculture component into those Lobito Corridor projects. So those 3 points made for me the story quite interesting to follow and to really see what's up, how it's going to unfold and how it's going to develop over time.
Yeah, like Angola's been very interesting in this respect, I think, because they're a little bit Vietnam-like in the sense that they maintain these very close relationships, very long historical relationships with China, and keep working with China, finding new ways of working with China, while at the same time really appealing to the US. So there's even under the Trump administration, there's been these kind of delegations visiting and so on, to try to, and a lot of kind of close conversation between the two. So it's quite interesting for me. Two things, like one is that, there is this traditionally, I think, in Western kind of like views of this kind of agricultural cooperation, there's this split between a pure aid approach, kind of looking at kind of like small scale farmers, rural empowerment and so on, and then fully commercial, essentially kind of paving whole kind of like square kilometers in soybeans. And the two kind of come together in this kind of like approach, because they are doing this very expansive kind of commercial farming. But there's also like seed development centers being put up, kind of being funded by Sinohydro and so on, which feeds into this kind of like China. What you frequently find with China in Africa is that there is these agricultural demonstration centers which are kind of co-run by the government, like government as an aid project, but then also with commercial seed companies and, like in collaboration. So it's kind of like half aid, half commercial. And this seems to be also kind of the approach here. And also with this kind of like hybrid approach of both commercial farming and small scale farming kind of like fit in. Other thing that was very interesting for me is like one of the Sinohydro officials was quoted saying that Angola is one of the easiest places in Africa to do business. And so I wanted to ask you about that. Like what you thought about that.
I mean, that's point when he said Angola is one of the easiest place to do business with. From a Chinese perspective, I would say yes, historically, they always had an easy environment to do business in Angola. But since João Lourenço came into power, things have been quite difficult for them. Let's face it. They've been seeing the influence, really shining out, and they've been seeing they've lost major contracts in infrastructure, the Lobito concession contract, the Lobito ports concession contract, the Benguela railway contract, all of that. They've kind of, and the Katoka gold diamond mine, all of that, Chinese companies have seen the influence, kind of reduce and not shining as bright they used to be before. So when he says that, we still understand that yes, it's not lovey-dovey as it used to be before, but yet it's still an easy place for them because they they still have a friendly environment where they still can do business. And this is something that speaks to the context when we do know that, for example, a few weeks back, we had a US Africa business summit that took place in Angola. And we had a lot of American businessmen, African business meeting there, talking about all kind of investment that the US want to do in Africa. And we also had last year, one of the main absent person who did not go to the FOCAC was João Lourenço from Angola. He was not in the FOCAC. So we have all those development things that have been happening in the last year and a half. When, for example, we spent like almost a year without a Chinese ambassador in Angola, it was quite difficult. So we had those kind of development where when we hear him say that, you know what, Angola is still a good place for us to do business, we understand that, say, politically we may not be the way we used before, but from in infrastructure, structural places, we believe that it's still a good place for us to do business. And as you say, and even the way Angola is managing its relationship with the US, with Europe, with China, it's not going to create a space where they're going to make Chinese feel unwelcome or feel, you know what, you're not welcome here anymore. You will not come here anymore because you don't really want to put all your eggs in the same basket. But I want to get back to the point that you made that I did really find interesting. The fact that we see a combination of both commercial and development aid. And we can see that hybrid approach can allow China to play on both sides of this narrative. That to say, you know what, on the aid front, we are present. We've been helping agriculture farmers in Africa to develop, to learn new technique and new approach, and to yield more crops and more results, and to really help fight hunger in Africa. And from a commercial side, they say, yes, we've been empowering them to become businessmen because let's not forget, we still have the non-tariff policy that China has put in place. And we do know that China has been working into compensating the trade deficit between Africa and China through agriculture. And many have been saying that when we look at the amount of agricultural yield that African farmers are putting, when you look at the demand that African market itself internally, we don't see how African countries are going to produce an excess in a way that they can export to China. So it's not really a solution. But when you see now China coming into that space, you realize that maybe they're seeing an opportunity here for them to say, you know what, we can play in a way that we win. We open our markets to agricultural products from Africa, but we're not losing in a sense where we are also the one investing in the farming product in Africa. So we are present there. So no one can accuse us to use African soil for us because what we are using it's actually to empower African farmers, even though a big part of it is going to come back to China. That's very interesting hybrid approach that I think that China is going to use into its narrative on how it's playing that card.
I think so. I mean, the another thing that's kind of interesting for me is, over the last year or so, we've seen very rapid increases of the same kind of crops, soybeans and maize, particularly from Brazil to China. Particularly as China was starting to kind of move to try and get to avoid exposure to the US. And actually, like if one checks the US kind of agricultural press, they're freaking out. Like, like it really is kind of crashing there. But I was wondering, there's an interesting kind of like Portuguese speaking connection, Brazil has always been a big, a significant influence in Angola. And there's, there is kind of these kind of cross-Atlantic connections. So it's I have no inside information about whether there's any kind of Brazilian connection, but it is an interesting kind of like connection between the two, between the two of them and China.
But beyond the two of them of China, when we see how the China is using Brazil and other Latin American countries to counterbalancing its offset of U.S. import or in terms of agricultural product, we can see the same logic playing out in Angola here, where China is really trying to say, you know what, as much as we're also relying on Brazil, we want to develop other supply chain of those agricultural products in a way that we do not find ourselves to be depending only on one single producer in Latin America, because it's still quite far from China. And having it in Africa is still an easy way for them to kind of balance out all the supply chain debate on agricultural products, and which I think quite interesting when if we follow closely how China has been looking into African lands and how China has been trying to shape the narrative in that agriculture debate. And this is one of the things as well, I think, that we're not paying attention from the science part of it, because they're also bringing new technology into farming, into agriculture. So when people are not paying attention to those kind of topic and subjects, they are missing the point that China, in the very below the radar, in those small stories, are shaping and are setting new norms in sectors where we don't pay attention. when we see the overall trend of what Chinese farmers and China is investing in this agricultural product in Africa, you're gonna realize that few years from now, we're gonna see that a lot of farmers have adopted Chinese technology, have adopted Chinese way of doing agriculture in Africa, which I do believe that if we don't pay attention to that, many are going to wake up and say, "Wow, China is taking over agriculture in Africa."
Yeah. I mean, it's really something to keep an eye on. I think, particularly also as you say, like I think there's going to be a lot of technological leapfrogging happening here as well. Because a lot of this in some cases these African countries are moving into this very intensive mass agriculture for the first time. So and China has a lot of very kind of advanced technologies around this. I was obsessed recently with this report that China developed an AI powered laser like anti-weeding robot that kind of crawls around and zaps weeds with a laser. Like it just thrilled me endlessly. So so it's going to be very interesting to see kind of how these kind of like technologies are applied.
You talked about that, and I remember when you mentioned that. I was saying that those kind of technology, I don't know if they're coming to Africa, but I know they're gonna come at some point, are going to be really appealing to African countries. When you do that in Africa, we hate everything that's has the appearance of being a GMO, something modified, because we perceive all of that to be dangerous to our health, to our health, and then we're kind of right on to a certain extent. So when we see now China is bringing a technology where we don't need pesticides to be able to keep our crops clean and weeding out all those bad weed from our crops, we should be expecting those kind of technology to be welcome in Africa. And people don't pay attention that China is slowly but surely shaping different sectors of African economic that we're not paying attention to.
Yeah. So, you touched on the Lobito corridor, and there's another kind of huge trend emerging, kind of related to the Lobito corridor, which is that the Trump administration has announced a 50% tariff on copper imports. So obviously the Lobito corridor is famous for trying to facilitate the flow of cobalt out of the DRC and Zambia, but cobalt and copper are, occur together. And copper trade is a very significant part of the Lobito corridor project. So I was wondering, how should we think about the 50% copper tariff? Like, who's going to be paying it? Who's going to be suffering from it? How is it going to affect Africa?
So, I mean, from an African perspective, I don't see much of because I don't see much of a huge impact on the continent. Of course, you have major producers like the DRC, Zambia, the two main producers of copper on the continent. But when we look into the export basket of copper and the destination, we see much of a China angle into it. Most of them are still exporting to China. China remains the main consumer of the copper coming from those two countries. I'm currently working into updating our copper cobalt database from the DRC with the 2024 data, which was really interesting because you see consistently China remain the main destination with different kind of stakeholders, but China, Asia in general, remain the main destination. Here and there you can see some hotspot of 1 time or 2 times kind of buying coming from the United States or buying coming from Europe, but most of it are still going to China. So when we think of that, I realize that at the end, if you're DRC, if you're Zambia, you're like, yeah, it's bad news to a certain extent, but fortunately for us, we don't rely to the American market as our main destination. China remains our main destination, so we don't see much of a long-term or significant impact on how we are going to build up. But for the Lobito corridor, it does remind me another conversation I had a few weeks back with a researcher, and we were talking about that. Let's face it, and I've been telling that Lobito corridor, it's the Benguela Railway. At least it's only a railway. It's only an infrastructure that, companies, being Chinese or non-Chinese, are going to use to export their copper and cobalt out of the region to the rest of the world. If it's not going to the United States, just like it's doing right now, majority of it's not going to the US, it's going to go to China. It's going to go elsewhere. And the Lobito corridor project is still going to be viable, because I don't believe that the consortium led by Trafigura had won the concession contract on the Benguela Railway with the idea that we are going to mainly to serve the US and European market. That was not the idea. The idea was like, we are going to serve mining companies which are trying to get the copper and cobalt out of this region quite faster, because taking the road down to Durban, it's quite difficult these days. So that was the idea. So when the DFC came, the United States came, they built the whole narrative around, the US and the Americans and all of that, Europe and all of that. It gave the impression that the Lobito corridor, the Benguela Railway, will serve mainly for European and Western market, which is not the case. Because when you talk to the consortium, they tell you beyond closed door that we are not really into that mindset. For us, any customer sending its copper, whatever they want to send it, for us, it's good business. So I don't know. I don't know if you see things differently from your side.
I mean, it's I'm so not an expert in this field that I sometimes kind of like doubt my own opinions. But one of the things that I immediately thought when I heard the news was, man, it must be the worst time to be someone trying to run a renewables company in the US. Because I mean, it's like open season on them, kind of like the copper, levy is going to hit them so hard, because copper is such a fundamental part of green energy, technology.
And then all of the other, not a big fan of it anyway. Well.
Sorry?
Face it, Trump was not a big fan of it anyway.
Yeah. Exactly. What do you think the impact is going to be on Lobito itself? Like, maybe let me rather say, how is, like, if, from your perspective, how healthy is the Lobito, commitment to Lobito looking from the US at the moment? Because I saw that they were name checking. They didn't seem to forget about it. In that kind of that investment conference that you were mentioning, there was a lot of people kind of like still talking it up. But then there's a lot of these kind of details coming through where you're like, oh, I'm not sure how this is going to work. So
yes, it's not true. One thing that we've learned from the U.S. Africa Business Forum that happened in Angola a few weeks back, that we do know that yes, they still remember Lobito corridor, they still want to invest in. The DFC is still, we're still gonna be there, but they also acknowledge that they were late. They haven't disbursed any of the money they've promised so far. That we know that they say that no, we're still gonna make that happen. We're still working to make that happen. But between what they say and how it's going to happen, I'm really not sure how things are going from. I'm not really sure how things are going from that perspective. But what I know from different stakeholders on the ground, when you speak with them, they tell you the Lobito, the project, at least it's viable. It's economically viable, because the constraint that we do see around the transport that are taking place in the region are offering an opportunity for the Lobito corridor to be an option for mining companies. If you can get to the ocean in 7 days or 11 days, than waiting for almost a month to get from Kolwezi or the Copper Belt in Angola to get to in Zambia to get into Durban, Lobito is still a winning option for you. It's still a winning option for you. Of course, for Zambia, they're gonna still have to build the greenfield portion between Angola and Zambia. This is, I think, the part where that can be now tricky, given the fact that if the money doesn't come up, Zambia may not see the green line portion of the Benguela Railway to be built, connecting Angola and Zambia, to connect that to the railway. This is the only impact I can foresee if the DFC withdraw its supporting, or if it's taking long to disburse the money they were expecting, that the concession, the consortium is expecting into this project. But as I've been telling to people, the Benguela Railway, as represented the Lobito Corridor project, it's economically viable. It makes sense. Even if the DFC pulls away, I believe that we're still gonna see a lot of banks, institutions willing to pitch in and to put money on the table. And I'm even foreseeing European banks being willing to do that, because let's face it, the companies that are running the consortiums are 3 European companies: Trafigura, Motengil, and Vecturis. And they're really making sense. I do believe that, yes, even if the DFC pulls away, we're still going to have some other companies. We may even see Chinese banking companies, Chinese financial institutions coming to the project and trying to make it work. But let's not forget, for this time here, DFC is not alone in that project. We also have the DBSA, which is also financing the consortium into that project. So for me, the Lobito corridor, I won't be worried about that much, even if the DFC pulls away or even Trump, skyrocket the tariffs on copper import to the US.
Yeah, and for listeners who haven't been following the story very closely, the DFC is a development finance corporation, a US government agency who focuses on channeling investment into infrastructure projects, overseas, or other projects overseas. And the DBSA is the Development Bank of Southern Africa.
Thank you for making that clarification. This is Eric. Usually what Eric does. When we start bringing up all the acronyms the short. Yeah. He said, no. Let's not pretend. Let's not pretend that all our audience are familiar with the things that we follow here. No. So yeah, really thank you for clarifying that. It didn't even come into my mind that I didn't even explain what the DFC is or what the DBSA is. Really, thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no, we live in acronym country.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, yeah.
So so staying in Southern Africa, in my own country in South Africa, they're now dealing with and freaking out about the fact that it seems like they're going to be dealing with 30% tariffs from the US. So they are, the US announced 30% tariffs. The South Africans say that they're still negotiating, but they're also saying that they're not getting any answer from Trump officials. They're saying they're trying to kind of get through to them, but basically no one's answering the phone. So now the country is kind of freaking out, because this is, the US isn't South Africa. China is South Africa's largest trading partner, but trade with the US is significant, particularly because some US companies are very heavily invested in South Africa.
300,
like Ford, for
300
example.
of all of them, I think. 300 also companies.
Yeah, exactly. So, so Ford, for example, assembles cars in South Africa and then ships them to the US. And so I've seen numbers that around 100,000 jobs, are on the line for, because of, due to kind of US South Africa trade issues. And so, like we've seen, what we've seen also in the same week is there was a huge artificial intelligence conference happening in China this week, like in Shanghai, like massive. The number of robots walking around in that exhibition hall was just crazy.
Yeah.
So the South Africans were there. There were a lot of global South stakeholders there, but the South Africans were really there, and they sent a huge delegation. And the communications minister was like meeting, and they set up all kinds of working arrangements with different Chinese companies, including Huawei, with ZTE, like a whole, different kind of like development, kind of initiatives. At the same time, while that's happening, South Africa is also in a fight with Taiwan. So they're trying to partly, I think, or largely due to pressure from China, they're trying to downgrade the Taiwanese liaison office in Pretoria, and they're trying particularly to force them to move to Johannesburg.
Yeah,
and
so become a trade office.
Exactly. In response, Taiwan is now threatening to withhold exports of microchips to South Africa. So there is this kind of like, this big kind of AI fight now, kind of like between where South Africa is kind of like stuck between the US and China, kind of in these different kind of geopolitical situations. So I was wondering what you make of all of this, like how, kind of how it looks from your perspective.
I have so many conflicting thoughts about that. At the same, when we see how things are unfolding right now in South Africa, you realize that South Africa just become the bad apple for the Trump administration related to Africa. There is a bill that are discussed on the Hill where they want to sanction South Africa. that they say the time for us to condone our friends that are still making friends with our enemies are done. We cannot keep on doing that. And South Africa cannot be considered as friends of the United States. When you see all of that, you see how South Africa itself puts itself in the crosshair of both Democrats and Republicans when it took on Israel and the Gaza case. South Africa really made things quite difficult for it in the same time, because also adding up the Taiwan issue, which personally I do believe that there's no urgency, there's no need of any kind of...
Why did they pick that fight now?
Why? Of all the things that you can do, why to put a fight with Taiwan over an office which basically has no impacts? No one's, when it goes to South Africa, you know what? There is a time. No one does that. I mean, why? But somehow they decided to make to make it a center point of the fight. I don't know why. But taking all of that into consideration, I just feel not sad for South Africa. I feel worried about South Africa because, let's face it, I understand South Africa is not a small country. It is not a big country. But South Africa is not also a small country. When I see all of that, I have the feeling South Africa is either holding or withholding its punches, or it's not sure of how high it can fight or how it can punch in this fight. Because Naledi Pandor a few years back said it, just reminding South Africa is still key to many to US car manufacture and industry, with all the palladium, all the minerals that South Africa is sending, critical minerals South Africa is sending to the US. So when you have that in mind, when you see that you have a Trump administration with the transactional mindset, all of that, when you see countries running around trying to make trade deals around critical minerals with the United States, you realize South Africa, you are not that weak. You are not that weak. You have leverage. You have enough leverage. You have political leverage. You have economic leverage. Political leverage because you can actually create a coalition on the continent to say, you know what, I'm bullied because I'm exerting my right to be a sovereign country who has the right to do business with whoever wants to do business. You know what? They can do that. But somehow you have South Africans freaking out, being worried about all of that, and which really makes things difficult. Before even me getting to the trade part of it, I want to get your sense on that. Why do you think that the ANC is, I don't know if you have the same reading than me, that the ANC is withholding its punches? It's kind of worried, or it doesn't want to fight back. It wants not a confrontation, but rather a trying to accommodate the Trump administration. What do you make of it?
It's an interesting question, because in some ways some of the things they're doing directly kind of antagonizes the US, and then in other ways where, where they could put up a more forceful kind of like pushback on key issues, they haven't. They've made a point of it, of not putting in retaliatory tariffs on US goods. And so far they've also haven't even in public, at least, only very rarely have they even raised the possibility of stopping kind of mineral exports to the US, which would be significant. Because the thing is, so South Africa has two really significant points of leverage. One is that in the mineral space, it has some of the largest deposits of manganese in the world.
Exactly.
And also, I think about 90% of platinum family minerals.
PGMs family minerals, yes. Platinum.
So this is like palladium, the different kinds of like used in high-tech
chromium,
applications.
vanadium, all of that, yeah.
Exactly. So South Africa has a world unique kind of like, deposit of those. And then South Africa also still sits and controls one of the world's most important shipping routes, particularly if there is kind of chaos in the Red Sea, then all of the shipping kind of like goes past the Cape of Good Hope. So there's this very significant leverage, but I think South Africa is hesitant to fully play those cards, because that is like really kind of throwing down the gauntlet, and I think the real thing, I think they in the short term that they are really trying to maintain all of these jobs, right? Kind of, and to not because unemployment in South Africa is already really high, and I think that they particularly kind of worried about domestic unrest around because the economy is already not amazing.
Do you believe that the GNU plays as a factor in a way to approach the situation?
I think so. So the GNU is a Government of National Unity, which is the South Africa the ruling, or the formerly ruling African National Congress Party, which was Nelson Mandela's party that kind of came into power after democratization. They were in power for 25 years, and recently last year they lost their majority, and they're now in a coalition government with a kind of a center-right party, which is also culturally a lot closer to the US. And so, so I think like there's been a lot of kind of like of gridlock within the Government of National Unity. And I think that, it tends to kind of like produce a kind of an approach where there isn't a very kind of clear point of view, kind of where it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And I think this kind of like mixed approach is probably, I agree, is probably reflected in the current situation with the US.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
But when we also know that when you look into from the economic landscape, the majority of those who own the big business that's going to be impacted by the US tariff in these wars are controlled by white people in South Africa. You kind of understand why they wouldn't feel comfortable to see South Africa going to a fight from an ideological perspective in a context where it can really put the business in danger.
Exactly. The thing to remember about South Africa is like it's an incredibly complicated culture, right? Because on the one hand, in some ways, South Africa is like classical, like left-wing internationalist, right? Kind of like there's a part of South African culture that comes from the kind of rootedness in that world during the kind of liberation forces of the Cold War, kind of very close to Cuba, for example, like that, those kind of like that kind of culture. At the same time, South Africa is very fundamentally shaped by Anglo-American culture. So the US, and particularly the way that the US in the Clinton era really embraced South Africa, really shaped South African national culture. So now this big fight with the Trump administration is a kind of a national trauma, I think, for the country, because while they are economically very close to China, they're not culturally very close to China, right? Kind of, they're not kind of like coming from the same world as China in the way that a country like Vietnam does, right? They are like, in a lot of ways, China is still quite far away for them, and quite kind of anxious making in some cases, even when people are very excited about working with China. So this, and they are very embedded, I think, still in this kind of Atlantic world. But now there's this strong feeling in South Africa that the Atlantic world doesn't want them anymore. So it was interesting, the bill that you mentioned, when we were talking within, kind of in CGSP, kind of Eric was saying, like, he can't understand why South Africa is freaking out about the bill so much, because it's coming as a form of kind of MAGA virtue signaling in the US, kind of from someone who's trying to kind of like climb the MAGA ladder, and from someone who's kind of a little bit outside of the mainstream. And I told him, look, it doesn't matter. From the South African perspective, it doesn't matter. It's America talking, right? Kind of like, and so they don't make those distinctions. They only hear America talking, and what America's saying is, we don't like you, right? So and the thing is also is that targeting land restitution and black economic empowerment and affirmative action, as one of the key things that the US is complaining about in South Africa. You can talk about how, like, the best way of doing that kind of reform, but you can't get around the fact that South Africa has to do this kind of reform, right? Kind of like the economy is still 25 years after democratization. The economy is still crazily skewed towards white people, right? And and the majority of the population still find themselves excluded from the main economy. So this is an ongoing problem that is causing ongoing kind of like unrest in the country. So South Africa has to do something about it. So it makes it very complicated.
But I don't really believe that the US really care about that. I don't think they really care about the fact that, land restitution. I think in this moment, the land, the wide genocide conversation was really hot topic when Trump was still friend to Elon Musk. Now
Yeah.
that they fall apart,
That's
I
that white
think
South African connection. Yeah.
exactly. They move away from that, but they still have the geopolitical angle to it where they blame South Africa for its connection with China, with Russia, and all of that, the Ukraines, the Gaza, all of that. We mentioned how much China is now main South Africa trade partner. But do you see China being able to replace what the US is doing in South Africa? Do you really see China with the abilities and the capacity, let's be honest, the willingness to do what US is doing in South Africa in terms of economic investment and all of that?
I think it differs a little according to sector. So apparently there is already talks with Chinese EV companies to try and kind of like, replace some of the US manufacturing in case people like Ford pull out. So in that kind of like, in those kind of like narrow fields, maybe. But I think, I think in lots of ways they're not replaceable, kind of one to one. So for example, South Africa is one of the most sophisticated medical research sectors in the global South, right? And part of that is from decades long collaboration with US institutions particularly around HIV and TB research. So there's no way of replicating those kind of networks out of nothing with China, right? China isn't particularly a big player in some of those fields. They're not particularly interested in those fields in some cases. So there's very kind of like specific US South Africa collaborations that are basically going up in smoke at the moment and that aren't really being replaced. And so I think that is what makes South Africa so anxious.
I think it's gonna take time if ever China wants to replace US to one to what the US is doing in South Africa. It's gonna take, as you say, there is this historical backgrounds, historical linkage, and social linkage where the South African society is much more anchored into the Western world than more than into China. China is really trying to make its headways in South Africa, but at the same time, you can also feel the angst in South Africa where they don't want to find themselves isolated from the US in a way that China is the only option remaining on the table. Which means that when you do have that, you don't have leverage anymore. It means that your remaining and solely partner is going to be able to impose conditions on you, knowing that you have no one else left. So I think this is something that South Africans are also considering, given that right now they still have this huge trade war between China and South Africa about who's winning, who's losing. And I understand why South Africa is really trying not to break everything out with the US, but at the same time, I'm kind of wondering why they're not pushing a bit harder. They're not pushing back a bit harder to get a fair and better deal than what they've basically been given by the Trump administration. This is really baffling to me. Really, I don't understand that. And I understand from a Chinese perspective, looking into that, I think that when they look at everything how African countries are caving to the US, they kind of wonder maybe we're the ones doing things too nice to Africans, because at the end they're all caving into a bully.
I think so. I think on the other side, I think the South Africans will say, look, it's fine for a country like Brazil to push back quite aggressively, right? Kind of because like President Lula has been quite pointed, right? Kind of in criticism of Trump.
Exactly.
It's different for a country the size of South Africa because it's, I think I think a lot of South African officials actually worried about is for South Africa to be basically turned into the new Iran. Some country that is just permanently tainted as a kind of an enemy of the US and just kind of gets stuck in that position, because for small, for smaller, and smaller, developing economies, they have so little leverage frequently in Washington that once that kind of consensus turns, it's very difficult to kind of turn it back. So I think that's one of the things that they worried about.
So they're really trying to maintain a certain equilibrium between the US and between US, China, and the rest of the world.
Yeah,
they're still very much present into BRICS. They're still very much active in everything that related to BRICS, to BRICS event and all of that. And I'm really wondering how they're going to manage a G20. G20 is coming, and they're gonna have to manage all those different interests. I'm really, really curious how South Africa is walking into making the AU voice heard. Is walking into maintaining the equilibrium it's maintained between China and its Western partners.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I'm looking out for is when or how, kind of like public perception of the US will turn in South Africa. There's been more and more, like prominent, kind of people in South Africa have been talking about the if there is massive job losses, then that kind of raises the possibility of social instability, in South Africa. And then people have been kind of warning about some kind of like, critical mass of kind of like anti-US sentiment, developing in South Africa. I also don't.
I don't believe so.
I think it would take a while. If it happens, it would take a while. But
it will take a while.
It's interesting to track, I think.
I think we'll see a massive anti-ANC protest. I believe that the Democratic Party, the Democratic Alliance, will feed the narrative that we are here where we are today because the ANC was stubborn enough to bully and to go on a fight with the United States when it was not needed. And because because this ANC wanted to make friends with unfriendly countries, with countries we are not supposed to be friends with to begin with. So I think that's going to be the narrative. And I don't think that South African society will turn against the US to embrace what? Chinese culture, Chinese approach, Chinese identity, Chinese way of doing things, which is still new to them and still unknown to them, despite they have a strong Chinese diaspora in South Africa. But I really don't see the mood changing, moving from the United States feeling toward a China sentiment.
It may not necessarily be the one replacing the other, right? Kind of like they could just simply be like just mounting unhappiness more broadly.
Yes, true.
Like I think one of the issues that is interesting and and kind of affecting South Africa beyond the specifics of the kind of narrow specifics of the relationship is how weak Europe has turned out to be in relation to the US, right? Kind of like Europe has folded, right? And so so in that sense that the choice in Europe to not kind of like position themselves in a somewhat more independent kind of foreign policy position, I think is then also affecting the options of all of these other smaller countries that have traditionally very strong connections with Europe, like the way that South Africa does, because South Africa-Europe relations, despite the fact that the US is culturally very, very strong in South Africa, so South Africa-Europe relations are like have a much stronger like historical legacy over time. So I think, the choice in Europe to fully align themselves with the US, to just absorb all of these things and not really push back, I think is also limiting options for all of these other countries as well.
Now that you're talking about that, it reminds me that I'm writing a paper on the future of the U.S. diplomacy, and I wanted to bring to kind of tease your brain on that, since you mentioned Europe. When we see how the United States has been behaving under Trump, bullying, no playing nice anymore, no pretending that we're nice people, but yet seeing partners and other countries are like literally caving in, folding to your demand. I now kind of wonder if Trump is not setting the tone of what would the US diplomacy would look like after him, in a sense where whether you have Democrats or Republicans in power, they've seen what Trump did. It's like, come on, we don't need to play nice anymore. We have basically can tell people, we are the United States. You don't do the way we want you to do. And they cave in. And they all caved in, except for China. China was trying to build an alliance of countries to resist, but China is realizing that many countries are just willing to cave into the United States and make any kind of concession, any kind of deal, just to be able to be on the good side of the United States. So I'm really wondering if Trump is not really redefining the momentum of what the US diplomacy is going to look like after him. What do you think about that?
I think yes. I think a lot of of leaders that are coming after Trump are going to be taking lessons from this and feeling kind of, I think, within the US, I mean, like, like US leaders coming after Trump will feel empowered, I think, to be more bullying and to also not have to connect the cooperation with kind of aid or other kinds of goals, right? At the same time, I also wonder if there may be a window that could close at some stage around these issues, because one of the things that we've seen, right, is that caving to Trump also doesn't necessarily help you, right? So, so for example, the Philippines were threatened with 20% tariffs, and then they really played nice. They were super sweet with Trump and so on. And then they came away with 19% anyway, right?
And then to be told that, you know what, you can be doing deal with China. China is a good friend of us. And I was
exactly.
Like, that's a moment you feel that ridiculousness in the conversation, but you do have those kind of situations, yeah.
Yeah. So in time, I wonder if if it comes, if like the Philippines, the UK, all of these countries that did go ahead and to make deals, if they then if those deals end up not helping them anyway, then I wonder if there's going to be a window where it's suddenly people turn and don't play as nice as they used to, right? I mean, we'll have to see. Like, I think what will happen in the US midterms next year will definitely affect it, but then also I think more specifically how the tariffs are going to affect the world economy. I think that's going
exactly
to be the real
definitely, and I wonder if when those countries are going to stop to play nice, if they're going to be turning to China, because China is the only one who say, you know what, you play hardball, we're going to play hardball. I'm not going to try to sugarcoat things. I'm going to play hardball with you, and let's see. China has been postponing. They've been managing to postpone my 90 days, all those tariffs, because they keep on negotiating. Because they still, holding stick and carrot at the same time. And China was saying that, you know what, you don't cave into a bully. You stand up to a bully. And what we see, many countries are folding, are caving in. And I wonder really at the end if China will be able to say, you know what, I was right from the get-go. Follow me. I see many global South countries, African countries being able to do that, but I don't see European countries doing that. I know that there is a strong sentiment in Europe to be able to say, let's carve our own way into those conversations. Let's not us align with one or another. Let's us being able to stand independently on that. But when you see what von der Leyen did a few days back in the US that was really criticized in Europe, you really wonder if they're going to have options to be able to stand to the Trump administration. Or as you say, maybe they're just waiting midterms, hoping that the Trump administration is going to be fragile enough to be able to say, you know what, we have now a certain sense of equilibrium back in DC. We can have partners with whom we can talk.
Yeah. I think then the big question is, and I think a lot of like no one wants to raise this issue, right? Kind of like, but the big kind of assumption there is that the US system, the US democracy will still function the way it always did, right?
Exactly.
And I think, like the next few elections, I think, are actually going to be a test of that assumption, rather than, we can't necessarily just assume that things will be the same, right? Kind of as they always did, as they always were. Yeah.
Exactly. We cannot assuming that the world will look like the same with the same US, since things have been changing so fast and rapidly. Cobus, it was really a pleasure to have this conversation with you. As dear friend, you've been listening to us. It was a round table, a much more conversation between Cobus and I, trying to wrap up all different issues related to China, Africa, US, all the conversation that we do have. Those are the kind of conversations we do have with ourselves during our meetings, have those kind of conversations. We say, let's bring those conversations to you so you can be part of our conversation today. I really hope that you enjoy this conversation. Don't hesitate to drop comments. It's going to be on YouTube, to subscribe, to be updated in every news that we every videos and news stories that we cover. In the China Global South, we have our EV shows with our colleague Jenga Ikena. We have our colleagues in Jakarta. Edwin was also doing a great work. We have people in South Africa, Cobus, myself in Mauritius here. We have a larger team with people in Middle East. We're going to open soon our Spanish edition. We're going to have an editor based in Latin America. We're going to be covering China in the Global South in Spanish in Latin America. So if you know someone, if you're really interested, if you you're a journalist, you experience, you follow China in Latin America. You want to apply, don't hesitate. I think that you can apply. We're gonna keep your CVs. When we're gonna open the application, we'll be really happy to have you in the team and to help us, further the conversation around China engagement in the global south. Last week, Eric said, I'm not gonna promise to say next week, but this week we managed to have our own roundtable, just Cobus and I. So I'm really hoping, I'm really calling it out of the sky and say, we're gonna see you next week for another roundtable of the China in the global south. See you.